So what we're going to try to do, building on the last talk, is to understand what's been happening, I would say, under the subsurface of easily perceptible reality. You know, the world manifests itself at many layers. You can tell that when you get into an argument with someone, especially someone that you love, because partly what you start arguing about is exactly what the argument is about, right? You need to specify the level of analysis before you can move forward properly. And specifying the level of analysis is a very difficult thing. So I'm going to try to specify, I'm going to try to make the case, or I'm going to make the case that what we're seeing unfold around us right now in this era of increasing polarization is the consequence of a very serious war of ideas that's really been going on for, I suppose, 150 years, and in some ways longer than that. And that it's necessary to understand the war of ideas, to understand the polarization, and maybe to see a road clear to ameliorating it. Talks entitled Identity Politics and the Marxist Lie of White Privilege. And I want to make a very careful case for the validity of that title, because one thing that's useful to note is that there is no question that some people have more privilege than other people. In fact, you might make the case that every person has more privilege in some manner than every other person. So you have to give the devil his due, so to speak. That's a very important thing when you're dealing with ideas. You can't just throw everything away, even if it is part of something that you feel deeply runs, let's say, contrary to your deepest moral instincts. You have to give it its place so you can formulate proper arguments. So we're going to try to do that as well. So we'll start with an analysis of the Marxist worldview, and I'm going to try to get to the bottom of it to some degree. So, for Marx, history itself could be viewed as a never-ending sequence of battles between the oppressed and the oppressor. Now, Marx was more specific than that because he took an economic view of history, a deeply materialistic view of history, and believed that people were fundamentally motivated by economic motives. I never did buy that because I think one of the problems with that theory is that it doesn't ever answer the question what it is that people value. It assumes value implicitly and associates that with economic well-being, but that's by no means obvious. It's certainly not psychologically obvious that that's the case, and it's not actually how people behave, by the way, from a psychological perspective. So that's a big problem, but it doesn't matter. It's a theory that has at least some hypothetical explanatory power and no shortage of psychological attractiveness. That's certainly the case. So anyways, the basic Marxist idea, as I'm sure most of you know, is that the social world and life itself is a battle between those who have and those who don't have. And that the reason that those who have is because they take it from those who do not have. And that's the most appropriate way to view history itself, I suppose stemming back as far back as you can imagine. And that it's also useful to think that way if you want to conceptualize the proper future, because the proper future would be one in which that essentially unjust division would be eradicated, so that everyone would be equal in some fundamental way, and so that there wouldn't be an owning class and a working class, let's say. Now, I had some sympathy for that viewpoint when I was a kid, and I think it does have to do with what the last speaker calls empathy. The world's a rough place, and there's no doubt that some people have it better at some times than other people, and some people have lives that are so unbearably tragic that it beggars the imagination, and other people seem to float through life with nary a worry, although I think that's also exaggerated, because no matter how well off you are economically, you're still not really free from the fundamental tragedies of life, right? Your loved ones still get sick and struggle through life, and you're still subject to aging and eventually to death. So it's not like even at the upper end of the distribution, you're necessarily protected against the essential tragedy of life. And I also think that that's another problem with the Marxist worldview, is that it implicitly makes the case that the cause of human suffering is social injustice. And that's true in some sense, in that social injustice can amplify suffering, but it's certainly not the cause of suffering. The cause of suffering, in some sense, is life itself and its fundamental limitations. And it's really important to make a distinction between those two things, because otherwise you can easily be tempted to assume that you could bring the utopia in if you only adjusted the sociological conditions properly. And there's just no reason to assume that that's a reasonable perspective whatsoever, as far as I can tell. I think it's actually a form of existential cowardice to assume that, because it doesn't grapple with the real problem. And the real problem is that, well, the real problem is, as religious people have stated over and over throughout recorded history, is that life itself is suffering. That's a fundamental truth. I mean, it's certainly the truth, for example, it's a Buddhist truth, a fundamental Buddhist truth, and it's certainly graphically presented in the idea of the crucifixion. So, and that's a hard pill to swallow. It's a bitter pill to swallow, and it's comforting, I suppose, to think that if you just adjusted society properly, that all that suffering would go away, but there isn't really any evidence that that would occur. Now, I read George Orwell when I was a kid, probably about 17. I read a book called Road to Wigan Pier, which, if you haven't read, I would seriously recommend. It's a great book. It's in the same line in some sense as Animal Farm, 1984, although it's more journalistic. Orwell went to this coal mining town in northern UK called Wigan Pier and documented the lives of the working class coal miners who lived there. And I mean, to call their lives difficult is like, you're not even scratching the surface, right? I mean, they were old by the time they were 40. Most of them had no teeth by the time they were 30. They lived in abysmal conditions, and the coal miners themselves, who of course developed black lung quite early in their life, had to crawl through short tunnels, 3.5 miles, just to get to their 8-hour shift, and then, which wasn't paid for. That was the commute, fundamentally. Orwell, who was a rather tall man, said that after 500 yards he could hardly stand up. And of course then they had to, I don't know, you don't call this crawling. It's not exactly walking. It's stooping, I suppose. It's not a normal form of ambulation. But in any case, they also had to do that after their 8-hour shift. And I mean, that's just the beginning. And so, you know, Orwell, he engaged in the kind of argument that I think it's Brett Weinstein has coined the term steel man. You know, you can make a straw man out of your opposition, which is a very bad idea, because it weakens your ability to think, but you can also make a steel man out of your opponent. And so you even amplify the power of their arguments if you can manage it, so that when you formulate a rejoinder, the rejoinder is as powerful as it can possibly be. And of course, this is exactly what Orwell was doing. He was saying, look, like, if you had any sense, you'd have compassion for these working class people, because their lives are just almost indescribably brutal. But then, you know, in the last half of the book, he wrote this for the Left Book Club, which was a socialist book publishing entity that put out, I think, a book a month. And in the last half of the book, he switched to an analysis of what he saw as the failure of the Labour Party in the UK to attract as much attention, as much support from the general population as you might predict, given the dismal conditions of the working class. And he wrote a line in there that I've never forgotten. I'd been working for a mildly socialist party in Canada at the time. I was about 16. You know, Canada has a fairly long history of democratic socialism, and for a long time, the democratic socialists were a genuine voice for the working class. And the working class needs a political voice. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But I noticed something when I went to the political conventions, and what I noticed was that although many of the leaders that I saw met at that time, because I had fortunate access for reasons I won't go into, actually did seem to be genuinely concerned for the welfare of the working class. The lower level functionaries, especially the activist types, I didn't trust them when I met them. I didn't like them. They seemed to me to be mostly peevish and resentful, and so they were motivated by something other than, I would say, sympathy for the working class. And Orwell said in the last half of Road to Wigan Pier that it was obvious that the sort of tweed-wearing middle-class socialist that was typical of the English socialist of that period, didn't like the poor, he just hated the rich. And I never forgot that because I had observed that. That's what it seemed to catalyze the intuition that I had and fully articulate the intuition I had that there was something rotten in the state of Denmark and that what might be passing for empathy was actually masking something far darker. And one thing you do if you're a sensible person is you view your own positive motivations with a bit of skepticism, So if you're running around proclaiming that you're full of empathy for the working class, it's always worth giving some consideration to whether there's darker motives underneath your so-called saintly goodness, because, saintly goodness actually happens to be in rather short supply. And so if you're laying out a claim to that, you better be sure you're right. You better be sure you've examined your conscience. And of course, people tend not to do that because it's a rather dismal affair, examining your conscience, and you tend to find out that there's many dark things going under the surface that you'd rather not admit. And that's certainly the case in our world right now. So I knew then at that point, and that really removed me from the political sphere completely for, I would say, 40 years, because I learned that I didn't know what the hell I was talking about, which is a painful thing to learn. But in any case, I was quite convinced by Orwell's analysis that there was something other than brotherly compassion motivating the theory that the world could be properly divided into the oppressed and the oppressor, and that all of the suffering of humanity could be laid at the feet of that division. Because there's something convenient about it, especially if you identify yourself as the oppressed, because it gives you a more instantaneous moral stature, and it gives you the opportunity to act on that hypothetical moral stature. And then I started to study what happened in the Soviet Union. So, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, but I'd like to contrast a bit the idea, this would be the classic idea of suffering in the West compared to the Marxist idea. And so, in some sense, suffering comes into the world from a mythological or symbolic perspective. When Adam and Eve become self-conscious in the Garden of Eden, they become self-conscious, they become aware of their own nakedness, right? And to become aware of your own nakedness is to become aware of your vulnerability. That's why people have nightmares about being naked on stage, And to know that you're naked is also to be aware of that is to also understand your limitations in time and space. That's also why Adam and Eve developed the knowledge of good and evil at the same time, which is a very difficult thing to figure out, because you see, if you know that you're naked and vulnerable and you know that you can be hurt, which is the same thing, then you know how to hurt other people. And you know that consciously. And that's something that characterizes human beings in a way that no animal is characterized. No animal has that knowledge. Animals are predators, but they're not cruel. Now, a human being can be cruel because a human being knows how he or she, himself or herself, can be hurt and hurt badly. And so you can't become self-conscious of your own vulnerability and your mortality without simultaneously becoming a moral agent, essentially. And so I found that very interesting. But anyways, you all know the story. What happens as soon as Adam and Eve have their eyes open and make these terrible discoveries, they're cast out of paradise. And that's a story about how painful it is to learn something that's deep and true, because almost always when you learn something deep and true, it breaks your current state of complacency and knocks you for a loop, and maybe you recover and maybe you don't. And I would say the entire corpus of the biblical works after the fall is an attempt to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That's one way of thinking about it, or to return to the paradisal state, or to determine how that might be the case. In any case, God casts Adam and Eve out of paradise, and one of the things he says, he explains to both of them exactly what their lives are going to consist of, and what they're going to consist of is a fair bit of suffering and work. And for the woman, it's work related to childbearing in many ways, but also a destiny of something approximating subjugation. Because of her vulnerable state, she's going to be under the dominion of the man, and I don't think God necessarily says that as a good thing. It's a curse. The whole post-lapsarian discussion with God is a series of curses, and the man, of course, he doesn't really get off much easier, because God points out that he's going to have to work for his living, which is something that only human beings do in some real sense. We we forego current pleasures in order to ensure that the future isn't as horrible as it could be. That's a reasonable way of putting it. And so in that document, which I'm making reference to because it's at the cornerstone of the ideas of Western civilization, suffering is something that's endemic to life. And of course you have a choice about what you're going to do about that. One of the things you're supposed to do about that, I suppose in principle, if you're a Christian, is accept that voluntarily, which is a very terrible thing to do, and that's associated, I suppose, with the imitation of Christ and with the idea that everyone has a cross to bear. The idea is that you have to accept that voluntarily, right, and take individual responsibility for it. And that's no joke. I mean, that's a hell of a thing to lay at the feet of someone that's vulnerable and mortal. You know, you might think that it's only the sort of burden that a God could take on voluntarily. Anyway, so suffering is built into the structure of existence, and there's no one there to blame except the human, original sin. I suppose that's one way of thinking about it, the proclivity of human beings to be self-conscious and to undermine ourselves constantly. It's laid at the feet of our intrinsic being. It's not someone else's fault. Now, you see that also laid out in the story of Cain and Abel, which is a remarkable story. It's only about a paragraph long. It's one of the most amazingly condensed stories that I've ever come across. And Cain really tries to blame his suffering on God. You know, his sacrifices aren't accepted. He doesn't really know why. The story kind of implies that maybe he's not putting his whole heart into it, you know, and he's very angry about the fact that he's breaking himself in half, you know, offering up these vegetables, and God is rejecting them. And whereas Abel, it's like he makes his sacrifices and God smiles on him and everybody likes him, and, you know, he's a good guy too, which is really annoying, because if you're successful, you should at least have the decency to be a jerk about it. So, you know, Cain has a little chat with God, and he basically says, you know, what kind of stupid universe did you make? Here I am breaking myself in half with all my sacrifices, you know, denying myself pleasure in the present so that I can regulate the future just like I'm supposed to, because it's the sacrificial discovery that's equivalent to this discovery of time. That's really something to know. And, you know, God basically tells him that it's his own damn fault that his sacrifices are being rejected, and that he's allowed sin to come into his life and, in some sense, interact with him creatively. There's a sexual metaphor in there. It's as if Cain has invited sin into his house and mated with it in some sense, and given rise to some monstrous thing that's now possessing him. So it's a creative union with resentment and hatred. And so God basically says, well, you know, why don't you go get your own house in order before you criticize the structure of being? And that's exactly what Cain doesn't want to hear. And he's not very happy about it, and his countenance falls, right? And then what does he do? He goes off and kills Abel, and then, you know, and he kills his own ideal. So that's a hell of a thing to do to yourself. You have to be pretty enraged before you'll destroy your own ideal, because your life is basically over at that point. And, you know, Cain says to God, after God gets wind of this, that his punishment is more than he can bear. And then, you know, the next story is the flood. And it's not accidental that those two stories are juxtaposed in that manner, because if that way of thinking propagates through the social world, which happens to Cain's descendants, by the way, then all hell breaks loose and everything's washed away. And so, you know, the story is set up so interesting that you have this initial description of the emergence of suffering into the world, and then the next story is the division of humanity into two warring forces, essentially, one of which is willing to make the proper sacrifices, whatever those happen to be. You know, and modern people make sacrifices all the time. We've transformed it into a psychological reality. You know, you make sacrifices so your children can attend university, you know, and immigrant families, first-generation immigrants, sacrifice the possibilities they had in their home country for a better life for their children. And we all make bargains with the future, you know, and that's a particularly human thing to do. And sometimes our sacrifices don't seem to be accepted, and that can make us very bitter. And, you know, that's the Cain and Abel story is a story of that bitterness, and there's a real reason for the bitterness and resentment, but the story makes it quite clear that that is not the proper way to react. Everything is washed away if enough people act that way about the structure of reality. And so, you know, thing you might ask yourself too is, well, how do you know about the Marxists? How do you know if most of them had sympathy for the working class? Maybe that was genuine. And how can you distinguish that from resentment of the successful, let's say, by whatever means or along whatever dimension that's defined? And I would say, by the murders. So that's how. Because it seems to me, and this is a case that Solzhenitsyn made very, very clearly in the Gulag Archipelago, which is a book that every high school student in the United States should read, and none do. So none of them know about any of this. And that's an absolute crime, and it's a consequence of the, I would say, leftist domination of the education system, because it's a crucial document, maybe the crucial document of the 20th century, and we fought a whole Cold War over those issues. We put the planet at risk to lay that genocidal ideology to rest, and we haven't done it, and that's worth thinking about. But, you'd think, and so Solzhenitsyn, he knew that there were, that ideas had other ideas wrapped up inside them in some sense, that an idea had a manner of unfolding in time and space, in some sense like a computer program. Once you put it into a computer, it had, its internal logic would reveal itself across time and space inevitably, and when the internal logic of Marxism revealed itself, then hundreds of millions of people died. And, it'd be okay if it was just maybe, it happened in Russia and nowhere else, but it happened across the Soviet Union, it happened across China, it happened in Vietnam, it happened in Cambodia. It's like, how many damn examples do you need before you think that something's rotten in the state of Denmark? We still got North Korea to deal with. I mean, what kind of place is that? Everyone there is starved, all the way through the 90s, essentially? It's a monstrous state, and it could still embroil us in an absolute catastrophe. So anyways, as far as I'm concerned, the historical evidence is in, and that the idea that the Marxist doctrine is genuinely based on sympathy for the working class is a lie. That history itself has shown that that's false. Now, maybe the revolutionaries back in 1917, they didn't know. They were, there was trouble in Russia in 1917, right? It was an ugly situation. And maybe they had sufficient justification to assume that their utopian vision was a historical possibility. I'm not convinced of that, by the way, but I think you could make that case. I think they were motivated by resentment and hatred right from the beginning. But you could make the case that at least they also had the benefit of ignorance, but we don't have that now. It's like, I don't know how much proof you need. If you need more proof than the 20th century provided, then the next layer of proof is going to be the annihilation of everything, because we came very, very close to that a number of times, especially in the late 20th century. So I'm buying the resentment and hatred story over the we're all possessed by empathy for our fellow suffering human beings story. So especially because I don't think that you get to be good just by adopting the proper ideology. I don't think that's how it works. That's a little bit too simple-minded in my estimation. Being good in a genuine sense is a very difficult thing. It means the opposite of being evil. And if you don't think evil exists, then you're not awake. And the opposite of evil, since evil is so attractive, is something very, very difficult to attain. And you don't get to portray yourself as good just because you've learned in a week the tenets of, let's say, postmodern neo-Marxist theory, which a week is about all it takes to learn them. In fact, you could probably learn them in an afternoon if it was sufficiently propagandistic. Well, so what happened? Well, you know the story. It's a terrible story. The more you read about what happened in the Soviet Union, I'm not as expert in what happened in China, although the death toll in China was larger than the death toll in the Soviet Union, and Mao was an absolute monster. Well, first of all, the Russians, and this is where the story gets interesting. This happened right in the 20s, so one of the first things that happened after the Russian Revolution is they're going to collectivize agriculture. And, wasn't that long before that the Russian farmers were serfs, right? They're basically slaves for all intents and purposes. They got freed, 30 years before that, something like that. No time historically speaking. And so a couple of them a small percentage of them had struggled up through the serfdom, through the post-serfdom era, and had managed to become competent agriculturalists, competent farmers, and maybe they owned a house and a little bit of livestock, and maybe they could even hire someone, so they're they're the petty bourgeoisie in the hateful communist lingo. And you know, the communists unleashed the full force of their propagandistic nightmare on them. And they rounded them all up and raped them and shot them and sent them to Siberia in the middle of the winter with no food and killed them all. They killed all the successful farmers in the Ukraine, for example. And that was an absolute catastrophe. And you know, it's really interesting to look at the details, because all you have to do is imagine a little town. If you know anything about little towns, you know, maybe there's a couple of people whose success puts them ahead above the rest, you know. And then there's the people in the town who are useless and don't do any work and aren't going to look in the mirror and think that they're useless and resentful and cruel. They're going to look in the mirror and say that they're the victims of injustice, and that the reason these people are successful is because they're crooked and they've stolen everything. And then the communist intellectuals ride into town and give them an intellectual story that matches their feelings of resentment, and all hell breaks loose. And that's exactly what happened. And you know, you don't have to use your imagination very much just to understand how awful that would be. And it was even more awful than you think. And then, of course, what happened was, because there was no more farmers left who knew how to farm, and collectivization was an absolute bloody catastrophe. 6 million Ukrainians died in the 1930s. You know, and if you went out and polled your high school students in the United States, I bet you wouldn't find 1 in 20 who knows about that. And you got to think, what the hell's going on? How can we not know about that? It wasn't very long ago. You know, it was a death toll roughly equivalent to the Holocaust. Now, I mean, the Holocaust had its own set of unique horrors, but what happened to the Ukrainians in the 1930s, that was no cakewalk. And that was just the beginning, right? You know, and that was kind of blamed on Stalin's cult of personality. But that's a post hoc rationalization for the catastrophic failure of a resentful ideology. And of course, there was the 1956 crackdown on Hungary and the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia. And despite the, what would you say, most pious wishes of the bloody Western intellectuals, the Russians, the Soviets kept doing exactly what they shouldn't have done if they were proper moral agents. But the intellectuals, generally speaking, were too hidebound and arrogant and resentful to notice what was happening and to comment on it, with very, very, very few exceptions. Orwell had a hell of a time getting Whig and Peer published. You know, it wasn't the sort of thing that the Left Book Club wanted to hear. And it just got worse from there. And I mean, it's not like people didn't know in the West. Malcolm Muggeridge had documented what happened to the Kulaks pretty nicely in the 1920s. Because, you know, it was complicated. We might have hoped that the Russian Revolution would succeed, and then the Russians were our allies in World War II, and you know, the whole Spanish Civil War messed things up from a conceptual perspective. But it wasn't like the intellectuals could have known. Orwell knew, other people knew, Malcolm Muggeridge knew. So it was head-burying in a terrible way. It's right, looking the other way when massive crimes were being committed. And the intellectuals in the West bear particular responsibility for that. So anyways, look, by the late 1960s, however, the stories that had come out of the Soviet Union and the historical evidence for their misbehavior had become so overwhelming and so awful that even the most stubborn of idiot French intellectuals had to admit that there was something up. Right? And that would include people like Jean-Paul Sartre, who really didn't repudiate the Communist Party till approximately 1968. He wasn't a card-carrying member, but he was certainly a sympathizer. And there were no shortage of sympathizers for Marxism among the French intellectuals, far longer than there was any moral justification for that. And again, I attribute that kind of willful blindness not only to a tremendous intellectual arrogance, but also to the unwillingness to cast aside their essential resentment. So then, you know, and then certainly even if communism, Marxism wasn't completely dead as a moral force by the 1960s, it certainly was dead by 1973, 1974, when Solzhenitsyn published the Gulag Archipelago, because that was a book of unparalleled moral force, and it absolutely demolished whatever moral and intellectual credibility communism had ever had, by documenting the causal relationship between the underlying doctrines and the genocidal consequences that followed. And Solzhenitsyn did it in a way that, well, no one has ever been able to repudiate. I mean, people will call him a reactionary now and cast aspersions on his name, but that doesn't mean they address the underlying argument, because they don't, because they can't, because it's not addressable. And so, Solzhenitsyn took an axe to the rotting tree and was one of the forces that had it fall. And, that was very disturbing to the French intellectual types. They weren't the only people who were trying to propagate the remnants of Marxism in the West. There's the Frankfurt School that was made reference to earlier, although I think the postmodernists are a much more insidious force than the Frankfurt School, because their Marxism is more hidden. But they basically pulled off an intellectual sleight of hand, which enabled the Western intellectuals, many Western intellectuals, to continue with their narcissistic, resentful, utopian visions under a slightly different name. And that's where we got postmodernism, and that's where we got identity politics. And so what's postmodernism exactly? And well, that's a tricky thing, it's like defining existentialism or phenomenology or any of these other philosophical movements. They're great social transformations, and they manifest themselves in many places. And to try to reduce them to a set number of principles is a very difficult thing. It slips out of your hands. And so any attempt to define is also an oversimplification. But nonetheless, we'll proceed with our oversimplification, because we have to do that to some degree to think. So postmodernism is an attitude of skepticism, irony towards and rejection of grand narratives. Well, that's a problem. It's grand narratives that hold cultures together. So it's fine if you reject them, and you can also point out that they're narratives, and you can also point out that they're in some sense grand fictions. And I'm an admirer of fiction, because fiction can tell you the truth sometimes in a way that fact can't. Right? Otherwise, we wouldn't read fiction. There would be no such thing as great literature. And so, to call something fiction, in some sense, is not the same as calling it not true. And that's a very important distinction to make. But they reject grand narratives. And that's a problem, because it's the grand narratives that unite us. It's certainly narratives that orient us as individuals. It's shared narratives upon which our society is based, and it's grand shared narratives that allow us to exist in peace within those narratives. So to call those into question is no joke. You don't do it trivially. And it's no different, as far as I'm concerned, than playing oppressor-oppressed politics in some sense, because the Marxists, what they were trying to do was call the grand narrative, let's say, of Western liberalism and capitalism into question, and the postmodernists did that under a different guise. Now, there were many factors that led to the rise of postmodernism, and I'll talk about some of the other ones, but there also reject ideologies and universalism, including objective notions of reason. That's a problem. Human nature, that's a problem. Social progress, absolute truth, and objective reality. Well, that's a long list of things to criticize, right? So we got to walk through that again. They criticize the notion of objective reality. Well, objective reality is a very, very complicated thing, and our knowledge of it is approximate at best. But to criticize the idea that it exists in and of itself is to destabilize us at the most fundamental possible level. And I would say that the fact that destabilization is an inevitable consequence of postmodern thinking is actually the reason for the postmodern thinking, right? Because it's a transformation. And I'm not inventing the idea that postmodernism is a transformation of Marxism. Derrida, who I would say is the lead jester who was running the postmodernist circus, has stated very clearly that his thought was a transformation and development, further development of Marxism. Objective notions of reason. Well, unless we share notions of reason, we can't communicate. We reject ideas of human nature. Okay, well, they did that in the communist countries. There's no human nature. Well, what does that mean? It means I can make you into anything I want. That's a big problem. Because it also replaces human nature with someone's theory of human nature. And if you think you have a theory of human nature that's as grand as human nature itself, then you're exactly the sort of arrogant totalitarian that's going to produce the kinds of theories that devastated the Soviet Union and China. You just do not know enough. You can't map yourself. You don't know enough about other people. So even if you have a coherent theory of human nature and it's relatively informed, let's say scientifically, it's fragmentary and partial at best, and there's no way that you can predicate an entire political system, a social system on that. You're just too ignorant. So it's a big problem to criticize the idea of human nature, and that's where you get the idea of social constructionism in part two, which is a terrible force that's invading, I would say, invading our culture especially at mid-level bureaucracy level, and certainly in the education system. You know, the idea that all of the elements of our identity are nothing but the consequences of enculturation. I mean, the underlying pathology of that belief is the justification for the people who hold the belief that they have the right to mold human identity in the image that they want to have it molded. So it's like the desire is the precondition for the conclusion. It's a very dangerous thing. So, no such thing as social progress. Well, that's the same thing as the dissolution of the meta-narrative. You know, if we can't agree on what's good, if we can't agree on what we're aiming at, then we're completely fractionated and divided. Because it's a shared aim, it's a shared vision that unites people. And I mean that technically, I mean that psychologically. Look, our eyes have evolved so that we can tell where each of us are looking. Because the one thing we want to know about all the other primates that surround us is what the hell they're up to. And one of the ways you figure that out is by looking at their eyes, and you see what they're pointing at. And if you're in a society, everyone's eyes are pointing at the same thing. That's what a flag is for, is to indicate a union of purpose. And if there's a union of purpose, then we're all predictable to one another, because we know what everybody's up to, and that's the same as peace. So you fragment that, you allow that to disappear, you criticize it out of existence, and you have an atomized society. And an atomized society is a violent chaos. It's not an anarchic utopia. It's an absolute catastrophe. I mean, you lose that hierarchical organization. You know, hierarchies, which the postmodernists criticize nonstop, hierarchies, speaking biologically, are at least 350 million years old. They're older than trees. Every animal that's evolved, virtually, exists within a hierarchy, because it's the only way that animals can share a domain, a territory, without constantly destroying each other. And so the attack on the idea of hierarchy, you know, in the guise of the patriarchy, which is so absurd that it's an idea that's absurd. You couldn't invent it. If it didn't exist, there's no way you could dream it up. It's an idea that's that absurd, because the hierarchical organization of society is something far older than human beings. It's a basic truth. And to consider that the cause of all human suffering, when in fact it's the cure for much human suffering, is another indication of the actual motives of the people who are putting the theories forward.